My name is Sarah, and like many women, I spent years building a life I thought was perfect. A stable career, a loving husband, and a cozy home in the suburbs where everything was in its place. I believed that if I followed the plan, our plan, everything would fall into place. But life doesn't always follow the script we write. Sometimes it throws us into situations we never expected. And when that happens, we have to choose whether to crumble under the weight of it all or find the strength to rebuild. This is a story about how my world was turned upside down and how, through all the heartache, I found a version of myself I never knew existed. It started on a chilly evening in March, just after dusk. I was sitting in the kitchen, flipping through a pile of bills, my mind wandering from the task at hand. My husband, Andrew, was late again, as he had been for months now. He worked in real estate, and his hours had always been unpredictable. But lately, it felt like he was disappearing into his job more and more. We barely saw each other anymore, and when we did, it was as if we were speaking two different languages. The first sign of trouble had come a few months before, when we were sitting in bed one night, and Andrew had turned to me, his face serious. "Sarah, I've been thinking. Maybe we should hold off on having kids." I had blinked at him in confusion, unsure of how to respond. We had been talking about starting a family for years, and it had always been part of the plan. But suddenly, Andrew seemed hesitant, as if the idea of settling down and starting a family was something he wasn't ready for anymore. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He shrugged, running a hand through his dark hair. "I don't know. Work is getting more demanding, and I'm just not sure if now is the right time. Maybe we should wait until things calm down a bit." I had nodded, even though the pit in my stomach told me that something was off. Andrew had always been ambitious, but I had never doubted that we were on the same page when it came to starting a family. His sudden change of heart left me feeling unsettled, but I pushed the thoughts aside, convincing myself that it was just temporary, that once his work slowed down, everything would go back to normal. But things didn't go back to normal. Instead, Andrew seemed to pull further away, spending more and more time at the office or out with colleagues. He became distant, and our conversations turned into short, polite exchanges, devoid of the warmth and laughter that had once filled our relationship. On that cold March evening, as I sat alone in the kitchen, my phone buzzed with a message. I glanced down at the screen, expecting to see a note from Andrew telling me he was working late again. But instead, the message was from my best friend, Claire. "Claire, Sarah, we need to talk. It's important. Can you meet me tomorrow?" My heart skipped a beat as I read the message. Claire and I had been friends since college, and we shared everything. The urgency in her message sent a ripple of anxiety through me, and I quickly typed out a response. "Me. Of course. Everything okay?" Her reply was immediate. "Claire, just meet me at the cafe at 10 tomorrow morning. I'll explain then." I stared at the phone for a long moment, a sense of dread settling over me. Something was wrong. I could feel it in my bones. The next morning, I arrived at the cafe a few minutes early, my mind buzzing with possibilities of what Claire might want to talk about. I had hardly slept the night before, tossing and turning as my mind ran through every worst-case scenario. When Claire walked through the door, I could tell immediately that something was off. Her face was pale, and her usual bright smile was replaced with a tight, anxious expression. She walked over to the table and sat down across from me, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for her cup of coffee. "Claire, what's going on?" I asked, my voice laced with concern. She took a deep breath, her eyes meeting mine with a mixture of sorrow and guilt. Sarah, I don't know how to tell you this, but you need to know. I've been putting it off because I didn't want to hurt you, but I can't keep this from you anymore. I felt my stomach churn as I watched her struggle to find the words. Just tell me, I said softly, though part of me wasn't sure I wanted to hear what she had to say. Claire looked down at the table, her voice barely above a whisper. It's about Andrew. I saw him with someone else. The words hit me like a punch to the gut, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. My mind went blank, and I stared at Claire, trying to process what she had just said. What do you mean? I finally managed to ask, my voice shaking. Claire's eyes filled with tears as she reached across the table, taking my hand in hers. I didn't want to believe it either, but I saw him with another woman. They were at a restaurant together, and it wasn't just a business meeting, Sarah. They were intimate. The room seemed to tilt around me, and I felt like I was going to be sick. I pulled my hand away from Claire's and stood up, needing to get out of there, needing to escape the suffocating feeling of betrayal that was crashing over me. I'm so sorry, Claire whispered, as I grabbed my coat and stumbled out of the cafe, the sound of her voice fading as I pushed through the door and into the cold morning air. The rest of that day was a blur. I drove around aimlessly for hours, trying to make sense of what Claire had told me. How could this be happening? Andrew and I had been together for almost 10 years. We had built a life together, made plans for our future. And now, all of that was crumbling before my eyes. When I finally returned home, it was late, and the house was dark. Andrew was sitting on the couch, his phone in his hand, looking as if he had just gotten home himself. He glanced up as I walked in, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Guilt, maybe, or fear. But just as quickly, his expression shifted, and he smiled at me, as if nothing had changed. Hey, he said, standing up and walking over to me. You okay? You look like you've had a rough day. I stared at him, my heart pounding in my chest. How could he stand there and act like everything was normal? How could he smile at me, knowing what he had done? Who is she? I blurted out, my voice trembling with anger and pain. Andrew froze, his smile fading as the color drained from his face. For a moment, he didn't say anything, and I could see the wheels turning in his mind as he tried to figure out how much I knew. Sarah, He started, but I cut him off. Don't lie to me, Andrew. I know. Claire saw you. His shoulders slumped, and he ran a hand through his hair, letting out a long sigh. I didn't want you to find out like this. I laughed bitterly, feeling a surge of anger rise up in me. How exactly did you want me to find out? Were you going to sit me down one day and tell me over dinner? Or were you just planning on keeping it a secret forever? Andrew looked down at the floor, his hands shoved in his pockets. It wasn't supposed to be like this, Sarah. I never meant for it to happen. Well, it did happen, I snapped, my voice breaking. So what now? Are you leaving me for her? He shook his head quickly. No, of course not. I don't want to leave you. I love you, Sarah. It was a mistake. A mistake? I repeated, my voice rising. You don't accidentally fall into an affair, Andrew. You made a choice. He flinched at the harshness in my tone, but I didn't care. I was done being patient, done trying to understand. How long? I demanded. How long has this been going on? Andrew hesitated for a moment before answering. 6 months. 6 months. My entire world came crashing down around me as the weight of his confession settled over me. 6 months of lies, 6 months of betrayal. I had been living in a fantasy, thinking that we could fix our problems, that we could get back to the way things used to be. But now I realized that everything had been an illusion. I turned away from him, unable to look at his face any longer. "I need some time to think," I said quietly, my voice barely audible. "Sarah, please," he started, but I held up my hand, silencing him. "I need space, Andrew. Just go." He didn't argue. He grabbed his coat and keys and walked out the door, leaving me standing alone in the middle of the living room, the weight of his betrayal crushing me. The days that followed were some of the darkest of my life. I felt like I was drowning, unable to catch my breath as the reality of what had happened settled over me. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't think about anything other than Andrew and the woman he had chosen over me. I didn't know what to do, didn't know how to move forward. For weeks, I stayed at home, avoiding phone calls from friends and family, retreating into myself as I tried to process the pain. Andrew called and texted me constantly, begging for forgiveness, telling me that he wanted to fix things. But I couldn't even bring myself to respond. One evening, after weeks of isolation, I found myself sitting on the floor of the bathroom, staring at my reflection in the mirror. I looked hollow, a shell of the person I had once been. The woman who had been confident, who had believed in the future, was gone. It was then that I realized something important. I had been so consumed with the idea of Andrew's betrayal, of what he had done to me, that I had forgotten about myself. I had forgotten that I was more than just his wife. I was a person with my own dreams, my own identity. And if I stayed trapped in this cycle of pain and anger, I would lose myself completely. Slowly, I began to rebuild. I started by going back to work, throwing myself into projects that I had neglected during the months of turmoil. My colleagues welcomed me back with open arms, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of purpose again. Work became a lifeline, something that grounded me and reminded me of who I was outside of my marriage. I also began spending time with friends, including Claire, who had been my rock throughout the entire ordeal. She was there for me on the days when I felt like I couldn't get out of bed, reminding me that I was strong, that I could get through this. But the biggest step toward healing came when I decided to confront Andrew. It had been 2 months since I had asked him to leave, and though we had exchanged a few messages here and there, we hadn't really talked. I knew that I needed closure, that I needed to understand why he had done what he did. We met at a small park near our house, the same park where we had taken walks together during the early years of our relationship. The memories of those times felt distant, almost like they had happened to someone else. Andrew looked tired when he arrived, his face lined with guilt and regret. He sat down on the bench next to me, his hands clasped in his lap as he waited for me to speak. "I need to know why," I said quietly, my eyes focused on the ground. Andrew let out a long sigh, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know if I can give you a good answer, Sarah. It wasn't about you. It wasn't about our marriage. It was about me. I felt lost, like I didn't know who I was anymore. And I guess I thought that being with someone else would make me feel alive again." His words stung, but they also brought a strange sense of clarity. He hadn't cheated because he didn't love me. He had cheated because he didn't love himself. It didn't make what he did right, but it helped me understand. "Do you love her?" I asked, my voice steady. Andrew shook his head quickly. "No, it was never about love. It was just a distraction. I never stopped loving you, Sarah." I nodded, feeling a sense of peace settle over me. "I believe you," But that doesn't change what happened. And I don't know if I can ever trust you again. He looked down at his hands, his shoulders slumping in defeat. I understand. We sat in silence for a long time, the weight of everything that had been said hanging between us. Finally, I stood up, feeling lighter than I had in months. I think it's time we let go, I said softly. I need to move on, Andrew. And I think you do too. Andrew looked up at me, his eyes filled with sorrow, but he didn't argue. He nodded slowly, accepting what we both knew was inevitable. Goodbye, Sarah, he whispered, his voice breaking. Goodbye, Andrew. And with that, I walked away, leaving behind the man I had once loved, but also leaving behind the pain and betrayal that had consumed me for so long. In the months that followed, I found a new sense of freedom. I had always been someone who planned for the future, someone who needed certainty. But now I was learning to embrace the unknown, to take things one day at a time. I focused on myself, on my career, my friendships, and most importantly, on my happiness. One day, while sitting at a cafe, sipping on a cup of coffee, I realized something important. I had survived. I had made it through one of the most painful experiences of my life, and I had come out stronger on the other side. The future was uncertain, and I didn't know what it would hold. But for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of it. I was ready to face whatever came next, with the knowledge that I could handle it. Because in the end, I had learned that life isn't about the plans we make. It's about the way we adapt when those plans fall apart. It's about finding strength in the face of adversity, and about believing that no matter what happens, there is always the promise of tomorrow.